All right, now that we've talked about rational numbers and what they are and how to convert between fractions and decimals and all that, we're going to be multiplying rational numbers today. So basically, we're going to be talking about fractions, multiplying fractions or multiplying mixed numbers together. And to multiply fractions, we're simply going to multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators. Top times top, bottom times bottom is basically how we're going to multiply fractions together. Pretty easy operation to do. So let's take a look at some problems here where we're multiplying fractions. Now, there's actually two major ways you can go about multiplying fractions together. Since the multiplication is commutative that we learned a couple chapters ago, we can actually kind of flip-flop numerators and denominators around. So that means anything in the numerators can simplify like a fraction with anything in the denominators. So we can either simplify first, then multiply, or multiply, then simplify. Those two steps when we multiply fractions can actually be interchanged, and I'm going to show you both ways to do that here in these examples. On the left-hand side, I'm going to multiply first and then simplify, and then I'm going to do the problem again where I show you how to simplify first and then multiply, and then you can decide which one you prefer. Here, when we multiply 1/2 times 4/10, we're going to multiply the numerators together. 1 times 4 is 4, and 2 times 10 is 20, and we get 4/20. And then if we simplify that, we get 1/5. Both of those are divisible by 4. Now I'm going to do the same problem again on the right-hand side, but I notice that this 4 and this 2 have a common factor. Okay, they have something in common, like I'm simplifying the fraction. So if I were to simplify 4 over 2, I could simplify that to 2 over 1. So these are both divisible by 2, so I divide them both by 2, and I get 2 over 1 there. And I also notice that this 2 and this 10 also have a common factor. So I can simplify that 2/10 to 1/5, and now I multiply 1 times 1 and 1 times 5, and I get my 1/5. So multiply, then simplify, or simplify, then multiply. You can actually do it either way. Next example, I have 5/12 times 6/10, and if I just simply multiply first, I get 30 120ths, and these are both divisible by 30, and I simplify to 1/4. Now, if I were to do it again, but simplify first, I notice that these two numbers have a common factor of 5. So if I divide these both by 5, I get 1 and 2. And then these numbers, 6 and 12, have a common factor of 6. If I divide them both by 6, I get 1 and 2. Now, if I multiply 1 times 1 and 2 times 2, I get my 1/4. So you get the same result. It just matters when you want to do your dividing, when you want to do your simplification. Last ones here. I have 3/4 times 8/21. And if I multiply first, 3 times 8 is 24, and 4 times 21 is 84. And this simplifies, these are both divisible by 12. I get 2/7. And then if I were to simplify first, 8 and 4 have a common factor of 4. So if I divide these both by 4, I get 1 and 2. And 3 and 21 have a common factor of 3. So if I divide them both by 3, I get 1 and 7. So 1 times 2 is 2, and 1 times 7 is 7. You get the same thing both ways, but it all depends on if you want to deal with smaller numbers first, or if you want to deal with the larger numbers and then simplify. I prefer the second column, so the rest of this video I'm going to be simplifying first before I multiply. So now we're going to be dealing with positives, negatives, and mixed numbers. How do we find the product here? Well, again, we use our multiplication rules that we learned before. A negative times a negative is going to be a positive, so I know that my result is going to be positive. I notice that I've got some common factors here. 2 and 12 have a factor of 2. So if I divide these both by 2, I get 1 and 6. And then these have a common factor of 3. And if I divide them by 3, I get 1 and 3. And that's going to give me 3/6, which is 1/2. half, positive 1/2, since it was a negative times a negative. Next one, I have a positive times a negative, so I know my answer is going to be negative. And I do have common factors here. 3 and 9 have a common factor of 3. Divide them both by 3. And I get 6, negative 6/33, which does simplify to 2/11, negative 2/11. And then mixed numbers. How do you multiply mixed numbers? A lot of people will multiply the whole numbers together and then multiply the fractions together and get something like 6 and 3/24. And that is actually incorrect. You won't get the right answer if you do that. If you're going to do this by hand, you have to convert these to fractions, not mixed numbers. So I need to rewrite both of these as fractions, and 3 and 3/8 is 27/8, and 2 and 1/3 is 7/3. And then I do actually have common factors here of 3. I've divided these both by 3. And now I can multiply and get 63/8. And you can leave it like that, or you can write it back as a mixed number, which would be 7 and 7/8. So either one of these answers would be acceptable, either the improper fraction or the mixed number, and that was going to be positive since they were both positive. And then, of course, we have evaluating expressions, and we might have a value of a variable that is a mixed number or a fraction, so we would need to know how to do that. So here, x, y, that means x times y, and x is 3/8, and y is negative 2 and 2/9. Again, if I'm multiplying by a mixed number, I need to write that as a fraction first, otherwise I'm most likely going to make an error. So 3/8 times negative 20/9. And I do have some common factors here. I'm going to simplify this before I multiply. 3 and 9 have a common factor of 3. Divide them both by 3. I get 1 and 3. And 8 and 20 have common factors of 4. So that's 2 and negative 5 there. I can't forget my negative. Don't lose your negatives in this process. I know my result is going to be negative. So it's going to be negative 5/6, and that is in simplest form. Next one, I have 5x, 5 times x, and that's 5 times 3/8. And again, I want to write this as an improper fraction, or as a fraction, 5/1 times 3/8. No common factors here, so that's going to give me 15/8, which is fine like that. Or I can write it as a mixed number, which is 1 and 7/8. Either one of these is fine. And then finally, y times z, negative 2 and 2/9 times negative 7/10. Since I have a negative times a negative, I know this result is going to be positive, so I'm not really going to worry about the negatives at this point, but I do need to write this mixed number as a fraction. This is going to be negative 20/9 times negative 7/10, and I do have common factors here between the 10 and the 20. That'll knock my numbers down a little bit. Divide these both by 10, I get negative 2 here and 1 here. And then if I multiply negative 2 times negative 7, that's positive 14/9, which is fine. Or I can write it as a mixed number, 1 and 5/9. So multiplying rational numbers, multiplying fractions, top times top, bottom times top, bottom. Remember to write all of your mixed numbers as fractions first before you multiply. That's going to save you some trouble in the end.